And we're back. This is where we left off talking about gender in the New Deal. What was new about the New Deal or the New Deal? Social planning or government social planning. And this is centered around the Tennessee Valley Authority, the massive public works program that was developed by the federal government in the Tennessee Valley with the purpose of maximizing the water resources there. And it was just a massive, massive project. You can go look at videos of it on YouTube and different things that they were doing, or you see some of it if you've, in a normal semester, we'd be watching the film Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, which features some of this work. But the goal of the Tennessee Valley Authority was to uh, rationally restructure and manage Mother Nature in ways that would make that part of the depression ravaged country could help more than just conserve the land, honestly modernize the land. The TVA is central to the concept of modernization in American domestic policy, but in its foreign policy too, as I'll talk about. The TVA, this kind of massive infrastructure project to build dams and move rivers here and there and all that fun stuff, was all about bringing electricity. We discovered electricity in the 20s and 30s. Shocking. I know. I know you get a charge out of my puns, so please don't vote. Stay right here. I'm done with all the puns. No more. Look out, he's got a pun. Sorry. I'm done. Okay. At the end of the 1920s, only 25% of American homes had electricity in them. And it was particularly the South. The South was, in the same way that people today might talk about the Sudan as a third world country or a developing country, that's how many Americans talked about the South. In fact, a report was produced in 1938 in which FDR claimed the South the country's number one economic problem. And a lot of it had to do with the kind of modernizing infrastructure, electrified homes, what have you, that had not touched large parts of the South. And so projects like the TVA and its sister, the REA, the Rural Electrification Administration, was intent to bring electricity into not just urban homes, but into America's farm communities as well too. And so something that we take for granted, or something we just never ask, like when did homes start having electricity run through them? Well, it began in the 1920s, but mainly for city folk. After the 1930s and into the 50s, it's really beginning for all of the United States. And it's happening in response to, I mean, you don't get this kind of action without the Great Depression, without the government saying, all right, don't let a crisis go to waste. Here's our opportunity for the government to take unprecedented measures like the TVA, like the REA, that in previous time would have seen as kind of government overreach or government intrusion, literally coming into our homes with wires and fire. In the midst of depression, this was much less unpopular, was much more accepted. And one of the consequences of the Great Depression is that the government was able to stimulate the modernization of the country in terms of electrifying its homes. Right? In the 1920s, you could thumb through catalogs and see push button stoves and push button washing machines, all these labor saving devices that free all Americans from the home, but especially free women from their domestic labors. All these things are emerging in the 1920s, but you can't take advantage of them if you don't have electricity in your home. And so the work that the TVA and the REA is doing with its democratic goal of electricity for all was really new really unprecedented. And I would say probably from our standpoint today, probably necessary. But the idea of government-run utility companies like the TVA, or government social planning, which the TVA was largely a part of, was controversial at the time, would become even more controversial after World War II. President Eisenhower in the 1950s was specifically named the TVA, a form of creeping socialism. That we need to roll back these government projects, these government utility companies providing electricity. Government shouldn't do that. It should be the private sector, right? And there's a fear that socialism is coming through these kinds of activities. Now, the counter argument to that, the guy who headed up the TVA, David Lilienthal, would say, look, yeah, this is government social planning, but it's democratically controlled social planning. Understand that it's not like when we put electricity in somebody's home, it's against their will. They want this. It's not like when we are modernizing homes or providing the means to modernize homes, there's great resistance. People want this kind of modernization. They want modern homes. They want indoor plumbing. What Lilienthal's getting at is to have a democracy in the modern world, or in a country like the United States. There's certain things need to be taken care of. You can't have a democracy if people are wondering where they're going to poop, where their outhouse is going to be, or how they're going to take care of those kinds of things. I mean, all the things that make a public or political life possible for us, all the different things that are home that make life easy, right? We know where we're going to poop, and ideally, we flush, and the things just work. We don't have to worry about that. We're freed up from those kinds of basic life questions by things like indoor plumbing, and sinks, and running water in our homes, and push button stoves, and laundry machines. We're freed up. Ideally, we're freed up so that we can do more of the Jane Addams public life, give to our fellow man kind of thing. Now, that was kind of the hope of people like Lilienthal, is as we modernize the South, and as we help Americans enter into the modern world through electrified homes and through cheap electricity, that they'll have more time for a meaningful public life. How has that worked out? What do Americans do with all the time, all the labor-saving time that they have, because they don't have to worry about where they're going to poop, or where they're going to wash their dishes, or how they're going to wash their clothes? What do we do with all that extra time? Do we do what Jane Addams did, or do we sit on the couch watching Netflix? Maybe we can talk about that in class. Final thing I'll say about the TVA is people from around the world, not just in the United States, but people from around the world came and checked out the TVA in 38 and 39 and saying, we need to do this in other countries. In the same way that the United States is modernizing the South through this project, we need to go and modernize Korea or China. And there was... there was talk in the 50s and 60s of a TVA on the Mekong River. And we actually would, in the 1950s, the United States actually would try to do a TVA project in Korea. In Vietnam in the 1960s. We don't specifically do a TVA, but we do try to take the government social planning model of the TVA. We do try to take that to Vietnam. So understand this modernization work that we're doing here at home. It becomes part of our foreign policy in the 50s and 60s and into the 1970s. That's more of a fun fact. That's not something that I'll necessarily pick up in future lectures, but I do want you to understand that the thin line sometimes between domestic and foreign policy history. In this case, the TVA becomes a centerpiece of our post-war foreign policy. So that's number 2, democratically controlled social planning, or, You can decide, right? Eisenhower calls it socialist. David Lilienthal says, no, this is democracy at work. You can decide what government utilities like the TVA. The TVA is still there today, although there is a strong push to want to privatize it. All right, let's get into some other new parts of the New Deal. As an extension or a part of the government or government-run social planning was government rebuilding community. This is number 3. The creation in 1935 of the Resettlement Administration. Remember in the last lecture I said the Depression was not like people lost their jobs and then they went back and stayed in their homes. That's not what happened. They lost their jobs and then they lost their land, they lost their homes, and then they were made stateless. They're traveling all over. I wish that I could play some of these poems that I have embedded in here, but anytime I try to play embedded audio, YouTube flags it and won't let me post videos there. So you just have to trust me that the migrant populations are spreading from the South. They're spreading to California, to the lower Midwest, to Texas, to Nebraska, to Oklahoma, looking for work. They're up and moving. Who's going to resettle these populations? Somebody in the New Deal says the government needs to do that. And so the Resettlement Administration is created in 1935 with the understanding that government needs to help resettle these millions of Americans who have been cut loose. And this is an interesting kind of side fact. Cut loose, these workers are cut loose not just simply by the Great Depression. They are cut by New Deal policy itself. The AAA there, that's the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, another centerpiece of the New Deal. The AAA was part of its policy during, it's created in 1933, part of its farm policy was paying farmers to slaughter livestock or to destroy crops. Right? It's that overproduction problem that we talked about. The government says, you destroy this stuff, we're going to pay you for it. And so a number of farmers are getting, these big government subsidies. Ideally, what they were supposed to do was to share that money with the farmers on their lands, the sharecroppers, but they don't. They keep it for themselves. And instead, what they do, these farmers, they take this government money and then they end the sharecropping system. They kick all these farmers off their land. And so it's in part the way that it's part of the way that New Deal farm policy is benefiting large farmers and giving them the freedom to basically evict tenants from their land. That is in part creating this resettlement crisis. And so in some ways, in creating the Resettlement Administration, the government's actually trying to fix a problem that it has created through the AAA. The Resettlement Administration, we created in 1935, runs till 1937, would provide services for as many as 2 million Americans during that time, and as many as it could, it would settle in over 200 government-created towns around the United States, some of which are still there today and stand as little towns that were created by the federal government. What made this a little more controversial was the government was doing more than just simply building the houses and churches and kind of Stars Hollow town hall meetings for people. Government promoted cultural programs. You see a group of artists there, performing. They're probably performing songs that were written by the federal government or people working for the federal government. Like song contests and music venues and all these different things. When I say that government is trying to rebuild community through the Resettlement Administration, it's doing more than just simply building the infrastructure of community. It's in joining a kind of cultural re-education. songs that you would hear in resettlement administration towns or venues would be like, cooperation is our aim. The idea was the competitive culture of the past is the past. Let's leave it there. And let's see how we can cooperate with each other. Let's see how we can get along with each other. And so government was intervening not just at an infrastructure level, but at a cultural level, an educational level through the resettlement administration. And this freaked some people out. It was in 1937 that some people started looking around the world and seeing resettlement administration, the government building homes, providing this kind of education for Americans. Is there anyone else doing that? And there were. There were people who were resettling their populations and engaging in cultural re-education. Nazis in Germany were doing this. The fascists in Italy were doing this. And so some American politicians said, maybe we should, maybe it's looking a little too much like fascism, right? Americans, for the most part, they liked the parts of the New Deal. Most parts of the New Deal were very popular, but the whole, Americans were scared of it. For as much as they loved FDR and as much as FDR had a positive effect on the national psyche, a lot of Americans talked about him as a political messiah. Like it's not, they recognize it's not a good thing for this kind of cult of personality to be built up around this individual. And so when they start finding out that we're essentially engaging in projects that are things that fascists are doing in Europe, we say, maybe we should abandon this. And the Resettlement Administration is closed down in 1937. It's replaced by the Farm Security Administration. The FSA will do pretty much what the RA did. It just, there was more of a kind of timeline built into it, more of a temporary nature. So, the Farm Security Administration did provide education, but the idea was vocational training. So we're going to take farmers and teach them how to be welders, for instance, so they can go work in a factory somewhere, because they're not going to be working on the farm anymore. We don't need as many farmers. We certainly don't need small tenant sharecropper farmers anymore. We don't need farmers like we did. And so how do we take these rural populations and turn them into suburban or urban populations? Well, they need new skills, and that's what the FSA is going to try to provide. So it still provides a kind of reorienting to American life, but on a more temporary basis than what the RA had tried to do. Why is this important for us to consider? Why was this part of the New Deal of government building or rebuilding communities? Why is this important for us to consider? Because it's still with us today. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans and just leveled the place, was there a thought of, well, sucks to be New Orleans, I guess that's it, that city's done, and if it wants to rebuild, the people of New Orleans can do it, but the government doesn't have a responsibility for it? No. The government put up, much to the consternation of his own party, George Bush and the Republicans, put up $240 billion to rebuild New Orleans. Whenever a tornado wipes out a Midwestern town, is the thought, okay, I guess we're done here, let's just move a couple miles down? No, the government provides billions of dollars to rebuild. When a flood hits Texas or Florida, there isn't this kind of throw up your hands. Well, as was true for much of human history and for much of American history, your town's wiped out. All right, don't build a town in Tornado Alley. Okay, so go live somewhere else now. That's not what we do. Now, government sees destroyed communities and government rebuilds them. When did that begin? It began in the New Deal. A government commitment that we're going to rebuild these communities. Okay. Number 4, government protection of mass purchasing power. More specifically, this number 4 is the Social Security Act of 1935. And hopefully you're familiar with the Social Security Act. Normally I would ask students what they know about the SSA, what two populations are mainly affected by the Social Security Act. And I'm going to assume hands are up and that you are saying the elderly, and you would be correct, and that you're saying the unemployed, and that would be correct too. And there's some other more special categories, disabled persons and others that are affected there as well too. But the two main are the elderly and unemployed. And the Social Security Act is an intention to provide money for people who are not, for one reason or another, can't have it. If you're unemployed, obviously you're not working, you're not making money. What did that mean? Well, at the start of the Great Depression, if you're not making money, you're losing your home, you're losing your land, you're being made not just jobless, landless, but as I said, in many cases, you're being made stateless, right? You're hitting the road with the family from Grapes of Wrath, right? The Social Security Act was intended to provide a kind of stability in times of crisis, or just a recognition that, you know, old age is not a crisis, but old age is a turning point, right? America is a different place, and in some ways the Meat Inspection Act suggested how America was a different country now than it was even 50 years before. The Social Security Act suggests that America is a different place too. We are a place where people are not self-sustaining. We are a place that we're a place that we go out and we work for somebody else, right? We are not self-sustaining farmers anymore, right? We're a predominantly urban and employee society. Well, what happens when, you know, in an urban industrial society, you just kind of age out? You can't keep welding or making cars or smelting steel. You can't, or you know, digging coal. You can't keep doing that until your 70s and 80s, right? And so the Social Security Act was kind of a recognition that at some point you age out of the kind of economy that we become, and who's going to ensure that you have some, you know, money to kind of continue to exist after that. That's the Social Security Act. Now, sometimes people misunderstand what the Social Security Act actually is. They think it's a government-mandated retirement program. So they think, you know, when Bailey Winalda, hypothetical student in her class, when Bailey Winalda you know, starts working for the first time, government starts taking money out of her paycheck and puts it in the Bailey Winalda Retirement Fund in Washington, D.C. And then eventually when Bailey retires, then she starts drawing upon this fund. You know, if that was the case, it would be easy for Bailey to just say, you know, I'd rather not have a government mandated retirement account there. And it'd be easy to kind of privatize Social Security, but that's not how Social Security works, right? Social Security is a tax program. Social Security pays for the unemployed. It pays for the elderly, current beneficiaries, by taxing current workers. So when you and I work, we're not setting aside money for ourselves. We are paying for the current beneficiaries, the current elderly, the current unemployed. With the understanding, or there's very much a mutualism, you might want to call it socialism, if you will, and that might be appropriate. I mean, the Social Security Act is something that socialists in the United States and Europe have been arguing for decades, and it's finally in the New Deal that they're embracing it. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. As you and I work, we're not setting aside money for ourselves. We are paying for the current beneficiaries, with the understanding that eventually we are going to become unemployed, or eventually we are going to become elderly ourselves, and then we will start drawing upon this Social Security money as well too. There's very much a mutualism aspect to it, and understanding the design of it, can you understand now why you can't just privatize this, or why it is that Bailey can't just say, "Hey, I want to opt out of this"? Bailey can't, because if Bailey opts out of it, well, yeah, it means more money for her and her paycheck. But her grandmother, who's receiving the Social Security money, she's not going to get that money now. This is why you can't opt out of this, or why it's nearly impossible to privatize this system. It's designed in such a way. It is designed in such a way that it's nearly impossible to reform. Social Security in your lifetime is a problem. In my lifetime, it's a problem that's been kicked down the road. It's going to be a problem for me. It's really going to be a problem for you. I usually poll students how many people think that Social Security, the Social Security Act, is still going to be in place when they retire, and very few hands go up. But then I ask the follow-up question. Okay, so if you don't think that there's going to be Social Security money for you when you retire, how many of you have already started a retirement account and are going to put lots of money into that account over the course of your young and adult life? And almost no hands go up there either. And to which I have to say that you got to do one or the other. Either you plan to count on this kind of subsistence level payment from Social Security, or you got to start setting aside money for yourself. But you can't just, pretend like there's magically going to be money for you at the end of your life if you think neither Social Security nor your savings are going to provide something. So you have to start thinking about, or having a strategy for your retirement. You need to start thinking about that now. And my own sense is that there will be Social Security there in some kind of form, because it's not like we've become a society of self-sustaining rural populations, right? We're still the kind of advanced urban industrial society today that we were in the 1930s, and so something like Social Security has to be there for when people just age out. Unless the thought is we're all just going to go become Walmart. We're all going to go become Walmart greeters once we, enter retirement, and maybe that's will be what will happen. I don't know. My father, my father retired from a 40-hour-a-week job to a 30-hour-a-week job. The guy's in his late 70s now, and he still is working 25, 30 hours a week, and then comes home and does yard work for forever, which is, I think, probably good for him to just keep moving. But it's also some people that are just never going to retire, and maybe that's the best. But yeah. So that's Social Security. What is this mass purchasing power? And here's where we'll kind of talk about the legacy or impact of Social Security. When we talk about America as a welfare state, we're fairly thin as a welfare state when compared to several European states, and a lot of Americans will say, well, that's a good thing that we are, and so it's something that we can debate. But the one thing that clearly marks us as a welfare state is the Social Security Act. Even just that name shows a shift in American priorities or American culture, right? If there's one political, cultural keyword in America, it's probably the word freedom, right? It's in the 1930s that Americans learned a new word, and that's the word security. Freedom is great, individual freedom is great, but individual freedom should be balanced by a concern for the Social Security, or for what the founding fathers had called public interest or public or common good, right? And so individual freedoms should be maximized as much as possible, but we also need to provide for the Social Security. And the Social Security Act literally tries to interject a new value into American life, for good or ill. You can decide Some would say, oh, the Social Security Act, that's socialism. That's socialism being introduced into America. When we understand the intent of the people who created the Social Security Act, it's much truer to say that they were not trying to turn America socialist. They were trying to save American capitalism. What do I mean? The person who did more than anything to kind of write up and market the Social Security Act, the Labor Secretary, Frances Perkins, what she would say is the Social Security Act had the goal of protecting mass purchasing power in America, meaning the recognition that, again, how does what sustains America's economy? It's mass purchasing power. It's the 80, 90, 95% of our population that buys stuff. Right. And this kind of economy runs because people buy stuff. And when they buy stuff, that keeps people at work in the economy. If there's a disruption to mass purchasing power, if the masses stop buying stuff because they don't have money, because they are unemployed, what does that do to the economy? The U.S. economy grinds to a halt because, again, it's based upon the consumption patterns of the 80, 90, 95% of Americans. And so how do you fix a largely consumer-based economy? Well, you have to get mass purchasing power up and running again. This was an argument that was made all the way back in the 1890s. I think I talked about this. Socialists who were arguing, hey, the problem isn't overproduction, the problem is underconsumption. People want to buy these food, they want to buy cigarettes, they want to buy bicycles, they don't have money to do so, and so we need to get money into their hands. Charles Conant talked about that in his article and says, yeah, there's some truth to that, but as a country, we're not ready to go down to the socialistic road yet. Well, in the 1930s, New Dealers like Frances Perkins and FDR were willing to embrace the underconsumption argument. They're willing to say that, yeah, the problem with the American economy is that a major problem with the American economy right now is that people don't have money in their hands. We need to get money into their hands, and how do we do that? Well, a social insurance program like the Social Security Act will do that. So the elderly can't work in factories anymore. Let's put a couple $100 in their hands each month, with the understanding the elderly are going to go out and, they're not going to use it on cell phones, right? They're going to go out and use that for rent. They're going to use it for utilities. They're going to use it for food, for clothes. And as they do, as they spend money, then the economy starts acting like a consumer economy starts acting like a consumer economy should, right? As people spend money, people make money. As people make money, they maintain their payrolls, or they increase their payrolls. This is the way the economy is supposed to work. And so the Social Security Act, if we can call it, or people want to call it socialism, and it is a marker of socialism in other countries, understand that the intent of the New Dealers was not to introduce socialism into America. It was to sustain America's particular form of capitalism, particularly its consumer capitalism. And you do that through protecting mass purchasing power. When people don't have money because they're elderly or they're unemployed, you get money into their hands. And as they spend that money, the underconsumption problem is solved, right? And so understand, you're free to evaluate the Social Security Act any way that you want, but the one thing that's not debatable is that people like Perkins and Roosevelt, they did not see themselves as socialists bringing socialism to America. They saw themselves as trying to save American capitalism through investing in Social Security programs like the Social Security Act of 1935. All right. Everybody's favorite subject, Keynesian economics, named for John Maynard Keynes, a British economist from this era. What are Keynesian economics? Well, if you've never heard this term before, you should, because you are literally in this past year and in the upcoming year, you are in a Keynesian age. Anytime that you've heard this word stimulus or stimulus check, or maybe you've received a stimulus check, you are a part of a Keynesian economic system. Central to the Keynesian theory is, how do you solve a problem like a Great Depression or a Great Recession? The government needs to stimulate the economy. The great image for Keynesianism, the great catchphrase of Keynesianism is priming the pump. And I used to use the old water to explain this. I used to use the old. You ever gone to like a state park yeah, I guess this isn't the, I don't think you need to prime the pump at Cedar Bend, but you ever go to a state park and use that pump and I don't know why I use that story, because I don't know how many of you actually have encountered an old pump like that needs to be primed. You're much more likely to have worked with a lawnmower before. So let's use the lawnmower example to explain Keynesianism. Keynesian theory suggests an economy in depression or recession is kind of like a lawnmower that is sitting idle. What you want is you get that lawnmower running again, right? And so what you do is you go and you start pulling on that string, and the lawnmower starts, right? No, it doesn't. You got to push that little red button on the side a few times. In my case, about 7 or 8 times for my lawnmower. What are you doing when you're doing that? You're priming the pump. You're pushing some gas out of the gas tank and into the engine. And you got to put, just some mowers a little bit, mine a little bit more, but you got to put some gas into the engine. Then you pull on that string, and what should happen, unless you're my lawnmower, you should be able to pull on that string and the engine starts firing, right? Spark plug kicks in, ignites the gasoline, motor starts spinning. Now here's the trick. Every few seconds, do you need to lean down there and keep pushing gas into the mower? No. Why? Because once that thing gets spinning, it just naturally sucks the gasoline into the mower, and that process of combustion just works. This is how Keynesianism is best explained or imagined. The lawnmower being, or the economy being the lawnmower, we want to get the economy running again. How do we do that? How do you get a stalled economy running again? Well, you got to put some gasoline in it. What's the gasoline? In this case, it's government money. Government's got to spend some money. Who can spend money that they don't have? This is called deficit spending. Who can do this? Generally, businesses, if they borrow money, generally you and I can, unless we got like credit cards. But government can. State governments can't do this. State governments can't do this. They can't. They got to balance their budgets. They're under a requirement that the state governments have to balance their budgets, even as painful as that might be. The federal government doesn't have to do that. The federal government can overspend. And Keynes is saying, in the midst of a depression or recession, government should overspend. They should put money into the economy with the understanding that as they do, that money is going to be spent. And as that money is spent, the economy is going to start acting like the economy again. The lawnmower is going to start going. It's going to start naturally pulling the gasoline in. And the end result of a running lawnmower, a running economy. So this is kind of the theory behind the stimulus checks that you and your family have received over the past year. Government gives you this money as you go out and spend that money. That allows businesses to keep their payrolls. When you get a stimulus check and you go and get takeout from Panda, that allows the teenagers at Panda to stay at work instead of being laid off. Because if they're laid off, then they're going to have to start collecting Social Security, right? Better for them not to go on Social Security, better them to stay on their payroll. And you can do that if you can get money into people's hands, but you got to get money into people's hands. Keynes is saying Keynesian economics is prime the pump, In a depression or recession, prime the pump, get money into people's hands. In your lifetime, that's been done through stimulus checks. How has that been done in the 1930s? Well, Keynesianism took different forms. Based on my description of the Social Security Act, you might be tempted to think that Keynesianism, the Social Security Act, is a form of Keynesianism. It certainly fits the theory, right? The theory of Social Security is, let's put money into people's hands who don't have it. As they spend that money, it's going to help the economy recover. The reason I would say Social Security is not a form of Keynesianism is because Social Security is a self-funded program, right? The money that is dispersed to the unemployed and to the elderly is money that has been collected through taxes of existing workers. In other words, Social Security, well, it hasn't been this for a little while, and we're going to have to figure out how to make it this way. But it's designed to be self-funded. And we can talk about some of the Social Security problems if you want to in class, but it's intended to be a self-funded program. The government is not going into debt, or at least theoretically, it's not supposed to go into debt to provide these Social Security kinds of payments. That's why I would say that Social Security is not a form of Keynesianism. So then what was? The public works programs of the 1930s. And after 1935, there's two central ones. The CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which is a public works program for young men to go out and predominantly to work in state parks and in rural situations. Roosevelt liked to think of the CCC as kind of his own little private army of young men. The WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which had replaced the Progress Works Administration, the WPA was a public works program putting American, predominantly men, because again, that's the gendered ideal, men work, women stay at home. The WPA is putting men to work from everything from building post offices and building university buildings. The university that I went to, my undergraduate, Bloomsburg University in my town of Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, there are different, some buildings on that campus that have the WPA symbol on them. They were built by the Works Progress Administration. My great-grandfather had been unemployed during the New Deal. He was given work through the WPA. He was a contractor. He oversaw the construction of some of these kinds of buildings. Why his daughter, my grandmother, was kind of a major supporter of the Democratic, just unquestioning supporter of the Democratic Party. It's because her experience of the Democratic Party was it gave her dad a job when he had nothing. It put food on the table. The Democratic Party put food on the table for her in the 1930s, and that was her experience of the Depression. And the WPA was incredibly popular. Look, these guys, they could work. There's no work for them. So what do? Let's provide work for them. Building everything from roads and post offices to the WPA gave jobs to photographers to go around the country and just photograph the Great Depression. The initial picture you saw at the beginning of the slide, the migrant mother picture, was a WPA photographer who traveling around the country taking photographs. Theater. Orson Welles, if you've heard of Orson Welles, he was a WPA director. Government provided money for theater performances, for writers, for artists, obviously. So all kinds of work being provided by the federal government, but for what purpose? The public works programs were an ideal form of Keynesianism. Guys can't work. Government should go into debt, providing work for these guys with the understanding that, one, they're going to hopefully engage in necessary projects like build buildings and things that we need. It's going to be a win for them because they're not going to be sitting around idle. They're going to have meaningful work. And they're going to get a paycheck. And when they get the paycheck, they're going to spend it. And when they spend it, they're priming the pump, right? When those workers getting these WPA money, or CCC money, when they go out and they spend that money, They're pushing the little red button of the economy. And as they spend money, that allows businesses to make money, which allows them to keep their payrolls, which eventually, the hope is, will end the Great Depression. Keynesianism rarely works as it's always the language of stimulus. Keynesian programs, at least in my reading of them, Keynesian programs have never actually started a stalled economy. The word that I have used, and interesting, I'm writing a book about a guy who was one of the chief advocates for Keynesianism in America in the 1930s, and I discovered this past year that he used the same term. The key word to understand Keynesianism is compensation. Keynesian policies keep depressions and recessions from being worse. If we evaluate Keynesianism in terms of, well, not how did the economy recover because of this program, but how much worse would the economy have been had we not provided this kind of aid or this kind of employment for workers. Keynesianism is probably better evaluated as a form of compensation for a bad economy. When the economy falls apart, the government should compensate for business failures of the business cycle by providing things like public works programs. Now, I realize that there are many economists, including the second floor of polling, which have very strong opinions against Keynesianism. And so I would encourage you to get their perspective on Keynesianism as well, too. But for me, and from a little bit from Gerstle, not in this chapter, but he'll talk about it more in the next chapter with the GI Bill, is understand that Keynesianism is a new introduction into American life of government deficit spending in order to, well, the idea was that Keynesian policies would help to start a stalled economy. In practical terms, what they've done is kept depressions from being worse, right? In the case of the public works programs, they provided employment for individuals, which gave, at least men, gave them hope, gave them a sense of purpose, gave them a sense that they were contributing to the public good through these public projects that they were doing. And allowed them to put food on the table. Them putting food on the table, it didn't bring us out of the Great Depression, but it certainly kept the Great Depression from being worse. At least that's my reading of Keynesian economics. I invite you to look at other perspectives, particularly from your business professors on the second floor of this building. All right. So that's one form that Keynesianism took, but another form is low-interest loans, and that was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation between 1932 and 1941. The federal government under the RFC would give out $10 billion in low-interest loans. The guy who headed up the RFC, Jesse H. Jones, had access to billions of dollars, which he gave out some to farmers. Some of these loans went to farmers to be able to help them to keep their land, keep their production, but a lot of the money went to businesses that allowed them to maintain payroll. You can think of the RFC a little bit like the contemporary payment protection program, the PPP. Maybe some of you have families with small businesses that received some PPP loans, or you worked for a business that received PPP loans. The idea was, the government's providing this fund, this money in a time of crisis, with the hope, or the intent of the PPP, is that businesses, particularly small businesses, would use most of that money to maintain payroll. And in fact, the loans don't even need to be repaid if most of that money went to maintaining payroll. So say you worked for a coffee shop that received PPP, and that coffee shop owner decided, I don't really have the business coming in here. I really should lay off Ruth. but I'm getting the PPP money so that I don't lay off Ruth. So Ruth is going to be able to keep coming in and sitting around doing nothing because there's no customers here, but she's going to keep getting paid because I'm giving her PPP money, and the federal government's going to say, that's good of you to keep Ruth employed through this hard time. You don't need to repay that loan. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation was kind of like the PPP. The difference is that most of the RFC money is going to Jesse H. Jones's friends, and it's going to larger businesses. And of course, that was part of the controversy with the PPP itself, right? The idea is PPP money is supposed to be going to like churches and small businesses, like pastors and legitimately small businesses. And we find out Shake Shack and Potbelly are getting PPP money. Hedge funds are getting PPP money. Is Shake Shack a small business? I don't think so. But it got the money. Is Potbelly a small business? I don't think so, but it's getting PPP money too. And that kind of, funny business, if you will, was there with the RFC as well too. There was a feeling that the RFC just didn't really even, didn't spend a lot of time figuring out whether this business really needed this money or not. It just shot the loan out. Considers the loan, move it, approved. The RFC suggests a kind of, Americans complain a lot today about welfare, but they're usually talking about things like food stamps or direct assistance programs. We don't spend enough time talking about corporate welfare. Corporate welfare, the tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars that corporations receive in tax breaks or other kinds of programs every year outweigh any money that Americans are receiving through food stamps or through direct assistance programs. And yet we just kind of turn a blind eye to should corporations be receiving these kind of government handouts, all this money that the government's essentially going into debt to provide this kind of money to corporations? Should they really be receiving this? It's also, if we want to get serious about welfare reform, shouldn't we start with corporate welfare reform? But the idea of subsidizing corporations for whatever reasons in whatever ways, or the government even going into debt to do so, we need to understand that Keynesianism has not always taken this kind of public works form. In fact, one of the major forms that Keynesianism has taken is more of a corporation form. And I'll talk more about that when we talk about World War II and the Cold War. But one of the legacies of the New Deal in Keynesian economics was not simply government handouts, but government handouts to particular groups of Americans, namely corporations. The public works programs, they kind of dried up by the 1950s, but corporate welfare programs continued pretty steadily into your lifetime. So if we want to get serious about welfare reform, let's talk about corporate welfare reform too, okay? And then the final thing that's new about the New Deal, you heard the phrase identity politics, right? The Americans organizing themselves around a particular identity with a particular political agenda. And identity politics today is usually seen as divisive. It's usually seen as a scourge or a bad thing in American life. We need to kind of step out of the post-1960s identity politics and understand how government has in some ways been working with identity politics, for much longer than, say, after the Civil Rights Movement and women's liberation. And so we can look at the New Deal and shifting Native American policy during these years. Last we talked about Native Americans, we talked about the General Allotment Act, and I talked about that largely as a land grab. Basically, Native American policy between 1887 and 1934 was a policy of not giving Native Americans much reason or much ability to move into the mainstream of American life, but dispossessing them of their land. That begins to change in 1934 with John Collier. Collier had been a Native American activist, an activist on behalf of Native American causes for decades. The Great Depression is again another one of those never let a crisis go to waste kind of moments, and so Collier takes the openness of government in the 1930s to push through the Indian Reorganization Act, replacing the General Allotment Act of 1887. The Indian Reorganization Act is significant for a couple of reasons. It creates the Indian Service, and John Collier had it up. The Indian Service will engage in two reforms that I think are of significance for Native Americans moving forward. First, it begins giving land back. I think, in its first 2 years, maybe longer. I'm sorry, I don't have my notes with me anymore, but the Indian Reorganization Act would give 2 million acres of land back in its first few years. Now, considering that it had taken 90 million acres between 1887 and 1934, 2 million is pretty slim. And I don't think there's much chance of them getting all that 90 million acre tribal land back, let alone all the other land that had been taken over the centuries. But still, it's a significant turning point. Government policy is not dispossessing Native Americans anymore of land. It's actually beginning to enable them to repossess land. The second thing, and probably just as important, is a move away from the assimilation policy. When did the federal government move away from the idea that everybody needs to be a Teddy Roosevelt, white male, larger than life American, that everybody needs to fit that kind of model? When did we begin moving away from that? Well, definitely in the 1960s, but we were starting to move away from that even earlier. And you first see that in changing government relationship with Native Americans. So the Indian Service, besides giving land back, it also began to recognize what Native Americans had wanted for quite some time, which is that they were a nation within a nation, or they were nations within a nation. And under Collier, the Indian Service would move government towards respecting tribal sovereignty, giving more autonomy back to tribes. We are not quite at multiculturalism in the 1930s by any means, as you know from reading the Gerstle chapter. But still, here's a government policy in which the understanding is Native Americans are not going to have to, give up their tribal ways and give up their lands and give up their languages and all these things, that they're going to be able to persist as nations within the American nation. So this is a significant turning point, certainly for Native Americans, but it's a significant turning point for government policy too, moving away from the melting pot assimilation, going all the way back to the 1890s, and a government which is more willing to accept difference and cultural and ethnic differences is not a bad thing, or not a thing that's not dangerous to social order. So I think when we talk about identity politics, we need to talk not just about kind of the divisive elements of American life, but the way that identity politics, particularly as government policies under the Indian Service, that identity politics is a form of multiculturalism and a sense that you can be an American and still be an Italian. Or be of Italian heritage. You can be a good American and still be Jewish or Catholic. You can be an American and be Native American too, or you can be Native American within the United States. And these things are not threats to social order, and they were in Teddy Roosevelt's day. Question that my students take up in my online class when they're reading the Gerstle text, when they read this chapter, is to what extent is FDR a kinder, gentler nation builder than maybe TR was? Is Franklin Roosevelt more welcoming of difference than was Teddy Roosevelt? Or is Franklin Roosevelt kind of continuing the assimilation, melting pot sensibility of his cousin Teddy? And that's, again, something we might want to take up in class, too. I think Gerstle provides some good evidence on both sides for that question. Okay, so we're done. So understand what's old about the New Deal, but understand all the different things that are new about the New Deal. Number one, government protection of labor, and particularly labor unions. Number two, government social planning in the form of the TVA. Number three, government rebuilding community, something that continues into the present today. Number four, government protecting mass purchasing power. Again, something that still goes into today. Number five, Keynesian economics. Government responsibility in a depression or recession. Obviously, that's something that still goes on today. It's going on, in this last year and in this next year, right? As we're debating the next stimulus package for the United States, and then the number six, identity politics, something that we'll come back and talk about more extensively in the 1960s. But I think it's important to recognize precedents for identity politics in American government policy. All right. Thank you all.